I've also been tracking through Advocacy America Jill Stein's environmental leadership and her absolute stance against gentrification, which we are here in the heart of West Atlanta that is under great risk of gentrification, and the communities that have lived here for generations being forced to leave because they will not be able to afford the property taxes. They will no longer have affordable housing to rent. And this institution itself is in danger. Already there have been two very famous historic black churches that have gotten involved with this stadium development, as you saw coming in, I'm sure. And one of them did take the money, and that historic church no longer exists. So it is real here as we speak what Jill Stein's leadership could offer locally to nationally. And I acknowledge all of you for being here to be a part of that. So give yourselves a round of applause. You need to know that what you're doing today and once you leave this auditorium is historic. You are making history. In the state of Georgia, in the Deep South, this is unprecedented to even consider having a third-party candidate be on the ballot in Georgia. And that is very real for us. And we only have a few more days to have it be real. So I want you to know there is an urgency tonight. You being here is not by accident. And there is a real request for any of you that have the space to be a part of this petition effort to do that. And tonight is an opportunity to get to see just why it's so imperative. We're going to give all of you an opportunity at the end of tonight to stick around that want to get a little training, to get a little sharing from the Georgia Party officials that are here and the organizers that have been doing the petition work on the ground here in Georgia. Some of you may know, and some of you may not know, that we did not know until sometime in March that this was even going to be possible. So if you can imagine trying to mobilize something with such a short deadline and make it happen, we really are in the space of causing a miraculous thing. And it's totally doable. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your listening. What I'd like to do now is just to bring up a leader that some of you already know who has been really at the vanguard in the city of Atlanta with these communities on the west side of Atlanta in really building the awareness and the capacity of the west side Atlanta residents to confront and to be included in the decision-making processes regarding this stadium and the major redevelopment that will be happening, as some of you know, through the revitalization of the Proctor Creek watershed basin. His name is Al Bartel. He is a certified mediator in the area of public policy management. He is now a mayoral candidate in the 2017 election cycle in the city of Atlanta as a Green Party activist. Let's get a round of applause for that, and welcome Mr. Al Bartel.
Well, hello everybody. Like we say out in South Georgia, hey, how y'all doing? I like that one better, right? So thank all of you for being here. We really appreciate you being here. So in the eyes of the Green Party of Georgia, the most important person on the planet right now for us is the person with your name tag on. So you should give yourself a round of applause for being here. Yeah. So I want to do two things. I want to deliver a communication, and then the second thing I'm going to do is introduce the presumptive nominee for president of the Green Party as the candidate, and in our minds, President of the United States of America. I'm going to introduce y'all to Jill Stein. Oh, yeah. So there are those of us who are neighborhood leaders, community leaders, faith leaders, and small business leaders. As a candidate for mayor in the 2017 election cycle in November, I am absolutely ecstatic that as we, as neighborhood leaders, community leaders, faith leaders, and small business leaders, reach out to the national candidates to ask, do they even care about our issues? The person that reached back was presidential candidate Jill Stein. You should applaud on that. Now, why am I saying that is critical? Because as neighborhood leaders, we are absolutely clear that we do not have the same access to public policy in America as the lobbyists, special interest groups, and corporations. As community leaders, we are absolutely clear that we do not have the same access to public policy in America as lobbyists, special interest groups, and corporations. As faith leaders, we are absolutely clear that we do not have the same access to public policy as lobbyists, special interest groups, and corporations. And as small business owners, we're clear that we do not have the same access to public policy in America as lobbyists, special interest groups, and corporations. And then as Jill has inspired us to include a fifth group, and that is all the people with student loans. And so as you've seen around the country at different times on live TV, you've had United States senators and United States congressmen and women come out and endorse a presidential candidate. You have seen governors and county commissioners come out and endorse presidential candidates. And you have seen mayors, and in particular, mayoral candidates, come out and endorse presidential candidates. So tonight, I'm going to make history and let it be known to the entire world that the mayoral candidate, for the first time in the urban city of Atlanta, Georgia, has publicly endorsed a candidate for president in the Green Party, and I, Al Bartell, as that candidate, here and now declare that endorsement. So my endorsement goes to Jill Stein because she is a visionary. She's clear that the two-party system is no longer working for America. She's clear that we have been excluded from the future of America. She's clear that the environment calls to us to be bigger than ourselves. She is clear that diversity is the mantle of the future. And as President of the United States of America, she will establish that as the platform for all of us as we move forward into the 21st century. So, ladies and gentlemen, will you stand and give a rousing applause to the next President of the United States of America, Jill Stein?
Well, wow.
like that, I feel like I don't need to say anything. And I gotta say, I'm just feeling that over and over again now, many times a day. I'm just seeing so many of us standing up and talking about the same vision for our future, about a future that puts democracy and justice and human rights front and center. And it says to these two political machines that keep trying to talk us down out of the future we deserve, we're saying to them, get out of the way, because we got a future that we got to take back, and we're in a hurry to make that happen now. I feel like every day I'm seeing how much power we have and how powerful this vision is and how many people have it. And when Carrie was saying, you are the most important person in the room, or maybe that was Al saying that, but I just want to agree that every one of us is leading the charge here for an America and a world that works for all of us. A world that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. Because right now they got it backwards. They're putting profit over everything, and it's driving us all over the cliff. There's really nothing out there right now that's not in a crisis. And this is an election where we're not only deciding what kind of a world we will be, but whether we will be a world at all or not. Because we're all in the target hairs right now, some of us more than others, but it's kind of hitting home that we're all on one small boat here. You know, and whether that is the small boat of a system of justice, of economic justice and racial justice and environmental justice, or a system of education that actually allows a younger generation to get the skills they need in order to survive in this world, that system has been in collapse in front of our very eyes, whether we're looking at higher education or just, you know, primary and secondary school. They are being privatized right out from under us. And suddenly we're going to school in order to get a high-stakes test, not in order to develop our human potential and our potential as members of our democracy that really depend on us being fully educated and competent citizens of America and citizens of the world. Or if you look at our environment, let's see, is this going to work for us?
Don't grab the podium. Don't grab the podium.
Oh, don't touch the podium. Okay. I'll try to restrain myself. All right. You know, in so many ways, it's like a very daunting, not just future, it's a very daunting now. And whether you're a worker looking for a job, you know, we're told the economy recovered. Oh, yeah? Who thinks it recovered? You know, not many people I know think it's recovered. We got jobs, some, but they're low wage and part-time and temporary jobs. And wages, in fact, now on average are, what is it, just barely above poverty. That's the average wage. It's really staggering. I think it's something like 40% of workers now that are earning less than $20,000 a year, which is substantially below poverty. We have a generation of young people who are locked in debt. And it's not just young people, it's going well into middle age, and a lot of people with my color hair who are still paying off their student loan debts because we don't have an economy that allows those debts to be repaid. And if you're holding debt, you're told, don't complain about that. You know, you get this guilt trip out there. You signed the contract, right? Well, that was a contract that Wall Street actually tore up because they crashed the economy through that waste, fraud, and abuse. We had that big crash in 2008 from which we really have not recovered. So they tore up that contract. Why should a whole generation of people be carrying around $20, $40, $60, $80, $100,000 worth of debt because you were told that if you did the work, You would have a good job at the other end. If you made the grades, you graduated, you did well, you worked hard, you were going to have your reward at the other end. Well, that reward hasn't come, so we're saying if we found it in our hearts to bail out the crooks on Wall Street who crashed the economy, it's about time to bail out the victims, the younger generation that has been plunged into predatory debt. And we're led to believe that, oh my God, there's no way we could fix that. But the reality is we can do for a generation of young and not so young people exactly what we did for Wall Street. And I don't mean we, I mean the guys in Congress and in the White House. What they did was basically cancel that debt through a certain kind of magic trick called quantitative easing. And we could talk about that more later if you want to go into the weeds. But it's basically something that the Federal Reserve can do, and it just so happens who kind of influences the Federal Reserve by choosing the chair. That is the power of the president. So the other piece of really good news here, 43 million young people locked into student loan debt is a winning plurality of the presidential vote. So just by notifying other people who are in debt, like a campaign like Friends Don't Let Friends Stay Home in Debt, we bring out friends in debt and a family member. If you do that, we have the ability to win a two-way race with the number of people who would be liberated from student loan debt. And there's only one place those votes can go. As you may know, you're looking at it right here, because we are the only campaign that on entering the White House, our first priority will be to cancel student loan debt. And it's not just for the younger generation, although it is at that. Let me say a word about that. Who here in their right mind would just throw your kid into a swimming pool and say, here, learn how to swim? That's not how it works. We teach people to swim before they get thrown in the water. Well, in the 20th century, you needed a high school degree in order to swim in the economy, and we provided that for free. So by analogy, in the 21st century, turns out, as I think everybody knows in this room, you need a college degree if you are going to swim in the 21st century economy. So by analogy, this is the right thing to do for our younger generation. No society has ever survived by devouring its young. But that's kind of what we're doing right now. We're sort of sacrificing our younger generation to a predatory economy that's always looking for the next cash cow to squeeze money out of. And that's kind of what the younger generation has become, is a cash cow for the predatory economy. So we say no to that. And it's not just for the younger generation, it's actually for all of us, because who is it that leads the way forward? Whether it's the civil rights movement a ways back or Black Lives Matter now, whether it's the immigrant rights movement, the Dreamers, whether it's the climate justice movement and the fight against environmental racism, or the workers' justice, the anti-sweatshop movements. I mean, one after the other, it's young people really who are endowed, by a package of life magic to be leading the charge into the future. That's just constitutionally what young people do, and we need you to do that. Because people with my color hair, we tend to have a kind of a filter, and we see things the way they've been, because that's just kind of how you get to operate in the world. You make certain assumptions about things, and you sort of see things the way they've been. But people who haven't been around for 40 and 50 years don't quite see things with the same history, so you're seeing things the way they are tomorrow. So if we're going to have a new society with a new economy that we need for the 21st century and the realities of today, we need you. Right now, you are missing in action because you're working 2 and 3 part-time jobs and just trying to keep a roof over your head. So for the benefit of all of us, yes, we're going to do it. We're going to do this. And by the way, that young people are really good at self-mobilizing, right? That's what the social media is about. And young people self-mobilize to all kinds of things, everything from Black Lives Matter, to the living wage campaigns, to the fossil fuel blockades. We haven't had a whole lot of corporate media on any of that. In fact, it's mostly resistance. So this is a generation that knows how to self-organize and has the tools to do it better than anyone. So this is actually a word that could get out. Word could get out that people can actually come out and cancel their debt by spending 2 or 3, or in some places 5 or 6 hours voting. But most of the time, people can come out and cast that vote knowing that we actually have numbers mobilized to cancel student debt. So we would not only do that, we would also make public higher education free. For all the reasons I've talked about, it needs to be free going forward. And by the way, when they say, oh no, that's way too expensive, well, they've got a really short memory span, because it wasn't that long ago that we had a GI Bill for returning soldiers after the Second World War that provided free higher education for everyone. And Congress was keeping count on the dollars. And it turned out for every dollar we spent on public higher education, on higher education of any sort, public or not, for every dollar we spent, we got back $7 in returns, in revenue and public benefits. So it pays for itself. Forget this nonsense that tells us that educating our younger generation is not critically important and not something that we can afford. We absolutely can afford it. Let me just quickly describe to you another major solution that is within our reach. That is an emergency jobs program to provide good, well-paying, full-time jobs for everyone all the time. And in this emergency jobs program, we also solve the emergency of climate change. These are 2 emergencies that very much need to be solved and can only be solved together. We can't tell people they have to choose between a climate we can survive in or a job you can survive with. We absolutely need them both. And it's by creating a Green New Deal, like the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression, but in this case with a green focus to address the emergency of environmental racism and environmental injustice. By doing them both at once, we can actually succeed. And part of the reason, we call this an emergency is because, in fact, it really is. The most recent science on this, if you weren't convinced by the heat waves and by the storm in West Virginia that just killed a couple of dozen people, and the flooding, the forest fires in California, the prolonged drought, which is raising the cost of food, and it's not only the drought in the Southwest, but droughts all over the world, particularly in Africa, and the heat waves, which reached like 120 degrees the other day, and I think it was Arizona or Colorado. In India, a month before, it was like 126 degrees. The pavement was actually melting. These aren't temperatures we can survive, and this is just a taste of what's to come. You get into a full-blown heat wave like that, your power fails, right? And then when your power fails, you have basically mass die-offs of people who can't survive at that heat for very long, as well as our food supply and our animals, which also cannot survive in that kind of heat. And as if that wasn't enough, the latest science is also telling us that these ice sheets, especially in the South Pole and the Antarctic, and in Greenland and other places, they're breaking up a whole lot faster than anybody ever thought. They're not just melting drip, drip, drip over a couple centuries. Now the science is telling us they are likely, if we keep going, they're likely to actually break up on us and lead to major sea level rise quickly. As soon as 2050, we could see 9 feet of sea level rise, is the latest information coming out from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They called this an oh my God report that they had just received. And we'll be hearing more about that as they begin to publish the data. But the point is here, we got to declare the emergency so that we can actually fix it. Because it turns out we can fix it. We can get to 100% wind, water, and sun. Clean, renewable energy, healthy, renewable energy, which creates millions of jobs because we've got to hurry up and get there. We can actually do that by 2030. That means an emergency program. You know, so we actually call this like it is. So we put people to work, like we did during the New Deal. We do that. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, at the outset of the Second World War, the U.S. economy was not on a wartime footing, 0%. It took us 6 months to move from 0 to full speed ahead for that wartime economy. Unfortunately, we have not yet gotten off of that wartime economy, and that's another thing that we can do with a Green New Deal, because it turns out when we have 100% clean, renewable, infinite energy supply here, we can no longer justify these wars for oil that are making us less secure, not more secure. We can bring them to a halt and cut our military budget. I'll come back to that in a minute, because the impact of the military budget is ginormous. I mean, they don't talk about it. They, meaning the two mainstream political parties, they don't want to talk about it because it is such a national scandal that this is going on. But let me just tell you one little factoid about this. We've all heard that the military is like the majority of our discretionary budget, our tax dollars, like the income tax and all that. If it's not like, so Medicare you pay through payroll tax and stuff like that. So outside of dedicated Social Security and Medicare taxes, our major general tax is largely going to the military. It's about 54%. What most people don't know is what the next biggest budget item is after 54%. Anybody know what it is? It's actually 7% is the next biggest line item after the military. And then it's a bunch of things at 7%. But it tells you we basically have a military budget with a lot of little footnotes on it for housing, for government services, etc. You can go look this up on the web. The National Priorities Project watchdogs this very carefully. So I was just flabbergasted when I looked that up, because I was curious. 54%, what's the next biggest item? 7? Are you serious? 7% is the next? The military is that much the heart and soul of the U.S. budget? This is absolutely outrageous and unacceptable, especially because it's not making us safer. It's just getting us into more and more trouble and more blowback and more prejudicing the whole rest of the world against us. So we'll come back to how to fix that in one moment. But just to first finish on the Green New Deal, the other thing I want to tell you about it, which is also a little known fact, is that it pays for itself, even forgetting the military savings for a minute. And that's one way you could pay for it. But there's another way altogether, and that is, believe it or not, we get so much healthier when we shut off the pollution, which is what we're calling for, zero pollution by 2030, 15 years from now or less, zeroing out the pollution as a national emergency to undo it altogether. Great for the climate. This is how we can basically stop catastrophic climate change. But in addition, it's really great for our health. Why is that? That's because the pollution that comes from burning this, I mean, a lot of people out there with asthma, I'm one of them. A lot of people out there with heart attacks, with strokes, with high blood pressure, even diabetes. It turns out this pollution is a contributor to all of that, especially to the lung diseases and asthma and heart attacks and strokes. And cancers, I should mention. So we get so much better so quickly by cleaning up the pollution that we save a huge amount of money. And the savings from our healthcare expenditures, and really it's a sick care system, it's not a healthcare system, but we're going to change that too. That savings is enough to pay the cost of the green energy transition. And the Green New Deal not only ends pollution, it also changes our food supply so that we're no longer subsidizing food that makes us sick and providing cheap food that makes us unhealthy, that's generating the diabetes epidemic and all the rest of it, and the high blood pressure and all that stuff. We're eating this very toxic food supply, which has been made very convenient and very cheap. Well, if instead we were subsidizing the healthy food and the small farmers and the community food co-ops and things like that, we would dramatically change our health because of our food system. And we also call for public transportation and funding that so that you don't have to invest in a car and be transported around by your car. Instead, we have safe sidewalks and bike paths so we can actually use muscle power to get to transit hubs. And that's actually how you create a really healthy society. In Copenhagen, 40% of people actually use bike paths to get to work or to transit hubs, etc. And that's how you get very healthy as a society. So doing all of that can massively reduce our healthcare expenditures. You may not know this. Here's another useful factoid. We spend $1 trillion a year right now on the military, but we spend $3 trillion a year on the sick care system. Believe it or not, if you add up public and private expenses, it's $3 trillion a year. And that can be cut, a whole variety of research shows, that can be cut at least in half if we were doing the right thing up front, instead of allowing this profiteering food system, a system that puts profits over people, and a profiteering energy system that does the same thing, and providing public transportation and sidewalks and bike paths. We get so much healthier. We could pay for all of this and have lots of money left over. They don't want you to know that, because if people know that, we're going to actually demand that. And if we demand that, it's going to shake up the system as usual, but we're going to get healthy. We're going to have an economy that works for us, that doesn't endanger us, and have a foreign policy that's actually consistent with an America and a world that works for all of us. So this is a win-win for everybody in the Green New Deal. A couple other things I want to mention because they're also very important. We deserve and we can have a healthcare system that provides healthcare as a human right for everyone. Cradle to grave. Whether you have a job or not, your pharmaceuticals, your reproductive health care, your mental health, your eyeglasses, your dental work, all these holes that are cut out of our health care. In order to be healthy, we have to be healthy from head to toe. Any little thing you leave out can be your undoing. You got to cover the whole person from head to toe and from cradle to grave, a Medicare for all system, an improved Medicare for all system, redirects our health dollars. It actually doesn't cost us a penny more. What it does is actually redirect our dollars from red tape and paper pushing, where we lose almost $500 billion a year in basically that bureaucracy. Instead, it puts that money into healthcare, and it does so by massively reducing that wasteful private health insurance bureaucracy. The health insurance policy of Medicare costs has an overhead of about 2% as compared to an overhead of about 20% in the privatized, complicated healthcare system that we have. So that's how we can get there. And by the way, it gives back to you your choice over your health decisions. They're no longer dictated by a CEO who's trying to squeeze maximum profit out of you. Instead, it's between you and your healthcare provider to make those decisions. And it gives you choice, again, about who your healthcare provider is and what hospital, what clinic, etc. that you want to use. So it puts you back in the driver's seat of your healthcare, not a bureaucratic CEO. And let me say a word about racial justice and what we need to do about that, because that is also an emergency. It's not a new emergency, as I think everybody knows. We know about police violence, not because it's new, but because we have new cell phones with good cameras on them. That's how we know about this epidemic of racist police violence. And, you know, racist police violence is like the tip of the iceberg of racial violence that's really hardwired into our economy. Economic racism is also a form of racial violence because it has real consequences. When the African American family in the early 2000s had 10 cents on the dollar of a Caucasian family, there's something really wrong with that, fundamentally and deeply. And that 10 cents on the dollar was then cut to 5 cents on the dollar after the Wall Street crash of 2008. And that really has not recovered. The economy has not recovered, especially for communities of color. And that's why I think this is really an emergency. It really requires, I think, a national dialogue, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about really the living legacies of the institution of slavery. It's been, unfortunately, a seamless line from slavery to lynchings, to Jim Crow, to segregation, to redlining, to the war on drugs, which has been a racist war on drugs, to police violence. And it's very important that we address this on many levels, because it's not only economic violence, it's not only police violence and violence baked into the very unjust judicial system that has been so racially biased in sentencing and in criminal prosecutions, let alone in arrests and so on, but also in our health and our health care. I was absolutely staggered to learn the information there that there's a 7-year loss of life that just goes along with African American health for all the reasons that are economic, but they're more than economic. There's a 7-year unjust loss of life in this racial disparity in health. Add to that, there's a 7-year loss of life for lack of adequate education. And unfortunately, those two come together way too often, where it's schools in the communities of color that are systematically underfunded, that are being systematically closed down and privatized, and whose issues are not being met, whose budget needs are not being met. So there's another 7 years of health disparity that's added on for unequal education. So that's why we really have, I think, an economic crisis, which is a crisis of racial justice. That is every bit as much a crisis as the other crises that we need to address and put on the table. Yes, and one of our wonderful petitioners back over there was saying, this is how we address that crisis. We get this campaign on the ballot in Georgia, and we make history. And we take back our democracy and the people we deserve. And we'll have a few minutes. When we conclude, we'll have a few minutes for those who would like to know how we take back the promise of democracy and the promise of racial justice and economic justice. How do we do that? How do we go on the street and ensure that we're on the ballot? And we'll have Victor say a few words about that, and maybe Bruce and a few others who are leading the charge on that. So you can hear it from the experts out there who are doing it and help make this happen. But I want to say a few words just real quickly about police violence and addressing the whole crisis of racial justice and racial violence. It's not rocket science how to end the crisis of police violence. Number one, we need accountability. And we need to ensure that communities control their police, not the other way around. So we need police review boards where citizens have the power to hire and fire their police chiefs and to review the records, of abusers. So they are not allowed to stay in the system. They're not allowed to continue to perpetrate. We also need to change how we hire so that we're not taking just people fresh out of military service and creating the sense that they can just continue that war right here at home and drop in. We need to end the militarization of our police. What is this? You need a SWAT team to deliver a summons to go to court or a pension system? So it's not rocket science how we fix this. And we need investigators so that every case of death or serious injury at the hands of police is investigated. We don't need an afterthought in the Department of Justice in order to find out what happened and who is accountable. So that's a beginning to ensure that Black lives matter and that they matter in every community all across this country. Let me say a word also about the crisis of immigration. And in a nutshell, you could kind of summarize that by saying, we don't need no friggin' wall, we just have to stop invading other countries. Where is it that this latest surge of immigration into the U.S. has come from? And then Europe is a whole other story, which is also about U.S. invading other countries. But right here in our own hemisphere, it's Honduras, it's Guatemala, and it's El Salvador. 3 democracies that were overturned by U.S. intervention and support. So, believe it or not, it has everything to do with overturning other democracies and creating violence and instability around the world. And then there's the war on drugs, which is also creating the violence that people are fleeing. 100,000 people killed in Mexico alone in the last 6 years. We need to end that war on drugs across the border and here at home. So we're treating substance use as a health problem, not a criminal problem. And that includes legalizing cannabis and hemp. But these are economic resources for small businesses, for everyday people in the community that you don't need to be a corporate player in the new world of marijuana legalization. We should not be legalizing marijuana in order to create another monopoly for corporate America. And this is also something that the president actually has executive power over, because the president, if she wanted, could do... Where were we? I think we were talking about immigration and the fact that we can fix the immigration crisis by not causing it in the first place. What a novel idea. And also that we owe a welcoming path to citizenship for the immigrants who are at the core of our economy, our communities, and our culture. This is something we celebrate. We celebrate diversity. And, you know, if we weren't in the business of destabilizing other countries and dominating them economically and militarily, we wouldn't be having immigration crises to start with. So that is a fixable issue. And then let me say a few words about foreign policy, because that's huge. That's this whole military thing. And right now, we have a foreign policy based on economic and military domination, and it is blowing back at us big time. We have spent $6 trillion, that's trillion, according to a recent Harvard study, we've spent $6 trillion since 9/11, and the trade towers went down. You know, this war on terror, so-called. And John Brennan, you know, the head of the NSA, he actually made a statement earlier this week about how, gee, the terrorist problem hasn't gone away.
They heard you talk about
Yeah, all right. So don't worry about that, John Brennan. And if you're listening, you do not have our permission. So he said last week to the press that that in fact we're not making progress. Isn't that amazing? We're not making progress by bombing terrorism. That in fact ISIS is even worse than Al-Qaeda was. That this is some disaster. Well, it's like, hello, you know, what created this stuff in the first place? It's that violence, it's that war. We all know where ISIS came from. ISIS came out of the disaster of Iraq. And Iraq, which was, yes, we can tell them exactly. It turns out, you know, why did we have that war in Iraq? Well, that was to go get Al-Qaeda. But where did Al-Qaeda come from? Well, oh my goodness, Al-Qaeda was a spin-off from US and CIA policy in Afghanistan, which nobody ever talks about, but we created the whole religious extremist enterprise to start with. The US and the Saudis created the international terror movement, associated that with the Mujahideen in order to try to stop the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And oh my goodness, what happened? Well, the Mujahideen kind of got out of control, and then the Taliban got a whole lot stronger, and then it actually led to the spin-off known as Al-Qaeda, which grew out of this same project. And this project had everything to do with the madrasas that Saudi Arabia established in order to promote its particular brand of very extremist religious beliefs, which are extremely intolerant. And are we back? I guess it's okay to talk about the problem. So, you know, we started it. you know, we started this whole terrorist enterprise. We not only started it, we and our allies, we continued it. And even Hillary Clinton herself, in a leaked memo from the State Department a couple years ago, identified the Saudis as still the source of major funding for Sunni terrorism globally, that it's still coming from the Saudis, in spite of the U.S. telling the Saudis supposedly to clean up their act after 9/11. Well, guess what? It never happened. That was recognized by the State Department, that funding is still going on. So it turns out you can't both fund terrorism and fight terrorism. We have to choose which is what to do. And it's not only the funding, it's also the arming of these terrorist groups. And right now, U.S. weapons, there was another expose about this just last week, about how U.S. arms somehow get intercepted by other players and they wind up where they're not supposed to be, you know, oh, surprise, surprise. And then there have been many exposés about how we have been arming other terrorist groups. Maybe not ISIS, but the terrorists fighting ISIS, you know, the Al-Nusra Front and others we have been arming, we and the Saudis, arming and funding. And, you know, terrorist groups are not like you sign on for life and that's that. You know, this is a mix of freedom fighters, of warlords, and of religious extremists, and they're constantly shape-shifting all the time. So you fund a warlord at your peril. And this has been the lesson of U.S., you know, war policy. As long as I've been paying attention to it, we've basically been buying off the latest warlord that we could get on our side, and then, oh my goodness, surprise, surprise, they change sides somewhere down the line. So we are the major supplier of arms to the Middle East, bar none. We're basically arming everybody and their mother. Anyone who wants to be a combatant basically gets armed by the U.S. So we're supplying the arms, we can shut down the arms and the ammunition. Instead of applying a flamethrower to the Middle East, which is basically what we are doing by arming all sides, you know, what a crazy thing that is. Well, actually, maybe it's not so crazy, because who is this for? This is basically for the war profiteers who are making out like bandits while the rest of the world is going up in flames. Our foreign policy has essentially been a marketing strategy for the war industry. It's time to shut it down. Because, you know, we're not going to survive very long like this. These wars have created failed states, worse terrorist threats, and mass refugee migrations. A new world record, 65 million people forced to flee, turned into refugees, largely by war policies, largely ours and NATO and our allies, but they mostly give us cover. This is largely US policy driven by us. So we say we've had enough. You know, doing more of the same. It's like, what are they thinking? You know, did we not pull out all the stops to try to stop Al-Qaeda? And all we did was create ISIS. We are not one bit safer. The Taliban is not one bit smaller. Al-Qaeda, you know, we turned Al-Qaeda into a global enterprise now. This fight is not working. So just undertaking another round in Syria to crush ISIS, that's not how you do it. We created it, we can shut it down by stopping the flow of weapons with an arms embargo to the Middle East and by freezing the funds, the bank accounts of those countries that continue to fund terrorism. So we call that a new kind of initiative in the Middle East, a new kind of offensive. A peace offensive is what we need, not another round of war.
Yeah.
And the broader aspect of that, if you generalize that, We are calling for a foreign policy that's very simple. It's based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy, period. So, bottom line is, we could actually have an economy that works for us. We could have a system of racial justice in our courts. And by the way, we need to send home from jail and pardon all of those nonviolent drug offenders who should not have been put in jail. Return them to their families and their communities, and don't just give them job training. Give them job training and then give them a job. And that is something we can do as part of the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal, by the way, creates a process that based in communities that is firewalled against big money, so that communities make decisions. It's nationally funded, but it's locally controlled through what's called participatory budgeting. Does that ring a bell for anybody? It's a system that allows communities to have dialogue and decide, not by $1 per vote, but by one person per vote, so that communities actually decide what are their critical needs that they need to create the jobs for. So nationally funded, but locally controlled in order to create sustainable communities. And that means sustainable not only in terms of ecology and environment, but it means sustainable economically, sustainable with racial justice, and sustainable socially. So that's what we can do. Bottom line is, this is the world that we can create. We have the solutions, we actually have the numbers that we could actually make this a reality. The name of the game these days is standing up and voting for what we want, not against what we fear. Because the reality is that this politics of fear, we've been hearing about it for a while, at least since Bush Gore-Nader. We've been hearing about you gotta vote against the lesser evil. The reality is that politics of fear actually delivered everything we were afraid of. All the reasons we were told you had to vote for the lesser evil. Because you didn't want our jobs going overseas, you didn't want the collapse of our wages, you didn't want this massive expanding prison industrial complex, you didn't want the massive bailouts of Wall Street, you didn't want the endless expanding wars, the attack on our civil liberties, the surveillance state, all those things, with very few exceptions, that we were told we would avoid is exactly what we've gotten because we allowed ourselves to be silenced. And it's essentially a race to the bottom between the greater evil and the lesser evil. We need to stand up. Democracy is not the sum total of what we don't want, and it's not the sum total of who we hate the least. Democracy needs an affirmative vision. It needs a moral compass. We have to be that moral compass. If we are not, if we silence ourselves to avoid the greater evil, then we create a moral vacuum into which the corporate predators rush, and they then take control. And that is just not workable if you actually look at how this works on the ground. The idea of the lesser evil is a false solution. It is a propaganda campaign. In the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We have that power. The lesser evil propaganda campaign tries to tell us we don't have the power. But what actually happens with the lesser evil thing is that it loses to the greater evil anyhow, because people do not come out to vote for politicians that are throwing them under the bus. Even if it's not quite as hard as somebody might be able to throw you, people just can't bring themselves out to vote. So in every midterm election, we've seen Congress and we've seen state houses and we've seen governors flip from blue to red since we've had basically a lesser evil Democratic Party. People don't come out to mobilize for it. So you get the greater evil anyhow. The bottom line is we are the ones we've been waiting for. Here's the one. And you know, that's what we're doing as Greens here, as Green candidates we are, and as a party. We're the only party of national stature out there that does not get poisoned by corporate money. We don't accept it. We don't accept money from lobbyists. We don't accept money from CEOs who hire lobbyists. We don't accept money from PACs or from super PACs. So we actually have the liberty to put on the table what it is that the American people want and what the American people need. So, you know, this is what people are clamoring for. I mean, to my mind, this is like, pinch me, am I dreaming? It's like so incredible. This is what we're hearing in poll after poll. This is what we saw with Bernie's success. And unfortunately, Bernie was sabotaged by a political party that is just not ready for the revolution. The clock is ticking in so many ways, whether you're looking at the climate meltdown or the next crash of the economy or the new nuclear weapons arms race, which we're now going full speed ahead on. You know, the next major Wall Street meltdown. The clock is ticking, and it's time for us to stand up and to forget the lesser evil and to fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it. Build an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit, and the power to create that world is not far away in our hopes, it's not just in our dreams, right here and now, it's in our hands. Let's make it so. We can do this together. We are